Hi, welcome everyone. Many thanks for joining our side event today on the environmental considerations of explosive ordnance contamination and land release. Just a few admin points before we get started. For those that are joining through the main website online link, we realise that you will not be able to kind of ask questions at the end in live time, but we've created a Slido for you. If I can ask colleagues to put up the slide. So please feel free to kind of scan the barcode or else go to slido.do and enter the number 870113 and you'll have a chance to submit written questions. And we'll also show this slide periodically through the event and again at the end. And then for those watching the event in the 19 MSP legislative system, you'll be able to raise your hand at the end of the presentation and our technical colleagues will inform us and then you'll be able to ask your question directly. So I hope that's clear for questions, and we do encourage people to ask questions and make comments and feedback at the end. My name is Lucy Pinches. I'm a project manager of Mine Action Review, and I'm delighted to be able to chair today's virtual event on the environmental considerations of explosive ordnance and land release. With the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, having concluded last week, the world's attention is on the environment, and it's a timely moment for the mine action sector to also reflect on the key environmental considerations of our work. Thank you to all of those that contributed or commented on Mine Action Review's new policy brief, including clearance operators, ICRC, UNDP, CEOBS and others, as well as national authorities and donors. It really was important for us to have the policy brief be inclusive and collaborative. And I just want to say thank you also to the governments of Norway, Switzerland and Canada for funding Mine Action Review's policy brief and making our work possible. So before I hand over to our panelists, I just want to say a few words on why Mine Action Review has produced a policy brief on mitigating the environmental impacts of explosive ordnance and land release, which my colleague Alex is going to be presenting today. Environmental considerations are rightly gaining increased prominence and awareness. Experts agree that there's unprecedented changes in climate and biodiversity, which are threatening nature and human livelihoods around the world. The humanitarian community increasingly understands the need to identify and assess how their operations affect the natural environment and to mitigate the negative environmental impacts where possible. And the mine action sector is no exception. Affected communities clearly benefit from the removal of explosive ordnance. We know that clearance saves lives, limbs and livelihoods, and it enables land to be safely returned to productive use. So it goes without saying that mines, cluster munition remnants and other explosive ordnance need to be located and destroyed. However, long-term harm can also be caused when there's environmental mismanagement. We know environmental impacts were first reported by the mine action sector more than 30 years ago, and in recent years the sector has begun to engage ever more meaningfully with this topic. We have the IMAS on the environment that was published in 2017, and there are some great resources and excellent initiatives taking place on the environment in many affected countries. However, we found that information was quite scattered and hard to access, making it difficult to clearly see the full breadth of issues we're talking about. So this policy brief builds on the existing knowledge and research, and it aims to present the key issues in an accessible format while offering recommendations. While it's not fully comprehensive, we do hope that it serves as an important resource for national authorities and their implementing partners as they seek to identify and minimise their environmental footprint. And lastly, we hope it promotes a discussion and stimulates further research, data gathering and sharing of lessons learned. If you haven't already seen it, the policy brief is available on the homepage of the Mine Action Review website, and we encourage people to take a read. So I'm now delighted to introduce today's panellists. We'll be starting with my colleague Alex Frost, who has been a researcher for Mine Action Review since 2018, and she's the author of our new policy brief. She has a master's degree in global health, conflict and security from King's College London, where she's also visiting research fellow. And Alex will be presenting the brief and highlighting the key findings. We'll then hear from Linsey Cottrell, who is an environmental policy officer at the Conflict and Environment Observatory, CEOBS, which is a UK-based charity working to raise awareness about the environmental impact of conflicts and increase protection for people and ecosystems. Her current role includes working with MPA on environmental safeguarding across disarmament programs. And Linsey is a chartered environmentalist and has worked in environmental consultancy sector for over 20 years before joining CEOBS. Martin Jebens is working as a weapon contamination advisor consultant for the ICRC Weapon Contamination Unit and the ICRC delegation of Japan, where he's leading a project on how remote sensing and artificial intelligence can improve detection of weapons or can be used for other humanitarian needs. Previously, Martin worked in the field of disaster risk management. He has a strong focus on innovation, improved coordination and planning to reduce risks and uses IHL, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction as guiding tools. He also has a background in mine action as a GIS manager and in environmental protection. And it was actually Martin who drafted the IMAS 713 on environmental management. And then last but not least, we have Bach, who works for Norwegian People's Aid in the Vietnam program as an environmental protection officer, working on building strategies and projects aimed at increasing the sustainable results of mine action operations by reducing their impact and promoting climate change mitigation and adaptation measures in operational areas. Bach has a degree in journalism in Vietnam and also a degree as an environmental technician with honours in Canada, focusing on environmental monitoring and assessment. Before joining MPA, he worked in the environmental sector for a local NGO to support the provincial government and local communities in developing capacity on solid waste management. So a very competent panel of experts. Looking forward to hearing their presentations, and I will pass over, first of all, to my colleague, Alex. Thank you. I don't know if others can't hear Alex. Alex, we can't hear you at the moment, sorry.
I was muted, so sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you now. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, so as Lucy mentioned, I'll be discussing the Mine Action Review policy brief today. Can you see my slide? Oh yeah, there they are, perfect. So next slide, please. So these are the 5 sections of the brief, which I will be providing an overview of today. So first of all, we're going to look at how explosive ordnance contamination impacts the environment. When an explosive ordnance detonates, it can cause soil degradation. As you can see from the diagram on the right, the blast generates a crater in the soil which displaces the fertile topsoil, making it more susceptible to erosion and causing compaction of the subsoil. The impact on soil is greater in dry, loosely compacted and exposed desert soils, and less severe in humid soils that contain vegetation. Soil is a living ecosystem and a finite resource, and depending on the ecosystem, it can take 1,000 years to generate just 3 centimetres of topsoil. Detonation can also release toxic pollutants into the environment, which can result in contamination of soil and groundwater. Detonation of explosive ordnance may trigger forest fires, and then these fires can trigger further explosions, which make it more difficult for firefighters to extinguish the blaze because of the contamination. And while it's difficult to provide an annual estimate, there are records of animals, including protected and endangered species, having been killed or injured by explosive ordnance. Next slide. When explosive ordnance degrades over time, its casings corrode and hazardous chemicals can leak into the soil and groundwater. This can be conceptualized using the source pathway receptor model, as you can see in the diagram. With the source being the item of buried ordnance, the pathway is the groundwater, which is the route the hazardous chemicals take to the receptor, such as trees and animals, which are then harmed by the contaminant. While there is plenty of data on this from within the military literature, there is limited data from within the mine action sector. And we want to stress that it's important that evidence-based decision-making takes place within the sector, which is based on empirical data rather than relying on anecdotal evidence. In Vietnam, for example, MPA is working with a local university to analyse soil samples in ordnance-contaminated areas to better understand the types of pollutants and chemicals found in the soil. This information will then be used to support local communities to make better choices about whether they should grow crops in these soils, and if they can, what crops would be most suited. Next slide. Yeah. Explosive ordnance contamination can also deny local communities access to productive land, such as farmland. It can displace these communities into more marginal areas, which can then contribute to biodiversity loss, as those communities are forced to hunt wildlife or destroy local habitats for shelter or fuel. In Lebanon, pasture land was left unusable due to cluster munition contamination, which led to overgrazing in accessible areas and habitat degradation. There were also instances of local farmers taking matters into their own hands and setting fires on contaminated areas, in the hope that this would detonate the cluster munition remnants. Unfortunately, this exposed the soil to erosion once the vegetation cover was lost. Next slide. In this section, we'll look at the impact of land release on the environment, the potential impact of climate change on land release operations, and the environmental impact of post-clearance land use. All clearance methods will inevitably have an impact on the environment, and the best way of reducing the environmental impact is to make sure that efficient and effective clearance takes place. So the evidence-based survey takes place before deploying clearance assets, so that uncontaminated land can be released and clearance is targeted only on areas where there is confirmed contamination. There are many factors which are taken into account when selecting a particular clearance method, such as the type and extent of munitions, the cost, the security in the area, the local infrastructure and the terrain. Environmental considerations should also be included and mainstreamed as part of the decision-making process. Previous slide, please. No, go back. Environmental assessments are generally not conducted as part of the pre-clearance process. So when vegetation is removed to prepare the ground for clearance, this can lead to the removal of rare species or those that are vital to the natural habitat or are of specific importance to the local population and which sometimes need years to be restored. Land may still have a high ecological value even if it doesn't have special recognition as an important habitat. According to the aforementioned IMAS on environmental management in mine action, the greatest concerns arise from mechanical clearance and bulk demolition, since these processes can have a severe environmental impact. Machines will have a significant impact on the soil and ecosystem if used as the primary clearance method. As is the case with agricultural machinery, these disrupt soil structures, which can accelerate surface runoff and soil erosion, the loss of organic matter and soil fertility, and disrupt water cycles, organic carbon, and plant nutrients. Vegetation will also be removed, but potentially on a larger scale than for manual clearance, and the soil will be processed. Heavy machines also need to be transported to contaminated areas on trailers or trucks. Depending on the route taken, this may also cause greater damage due to the tracking and rutting of the soil. In a study conducted in Kuwait, it was found that when heavy demining equipment and machinery was used, it caused soil compaction and reduced the rate of water infiltration by up to 97% in certain areas. Open burning or open detonation remains a widely used method of explosive ordnance disposal, which releases explosive residues into the environment. The contamination risk is highest in bulk demolition sites, where repeated demolitions occur, which are in areas of substantial rainfall with porous soils, a shallow groundwater table, and that are adjacent to marshes, swamps, or estuaries. In 2018 to 19, MI's advisory group partnered with Ohio State University to conduct an analysis of the soil around detonation sites in Cambodia. It was found that heavy metals in the soil increased by up to 30% following detonation in a 1 meter radius around the detonation point. Next slide. In addition to the clearance methods themselves, negative environmental impacts may also result from the establishment of work sites and temporary accommodation to house deminers and other operational staff. The waste that's generated from mine clearance operations, as well as from repair, maintenance and servicing of equipment. Land release operations have their own carbon footprint, which relates to the use of fuel, electricity and resources in the supply chain. Greenhouse gases are produced, for example, by an organisation's fleet of vehicles, by its generators, which are often powered by diesel fuel, by fossil fuel generated electricity in offices and at work sites, and by flights, both national and international. Next slide, please. Mine clearance programs are already being negatively impacted by the effects of climate change, and this will inevitably increase in the coming years. However, the impacts of climate change are not currently being considered during tasking and prioritisation processes, which predominantly is still focused on land use for socioeconomic development. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this example because Bach's going to talk about Vietnam in more detail, but during 2020, central Vietnam was subjected to unprecedented floodings and landslides. Both MPA and Peace Trees Vietnam reported that clearance operations were forced to stand down for several weeks due to flooding, and that they anticipate that over the next 20 years, the local population will move from flatter flood-prone areas to higher ground near the borders with Cambodia and Lao PDR. These areas are still heavily contaminated with UXO, but are currently sparsely populated and have yet to be prioritised in clearance strategies. MPA have also told us that they're building networks and partnerships with local and national environmental and climate change organisations. We encourage national mine action authorities and mine action operators not to reinvent the wheel, but instead to act as an important bridge for linking communities to the right organisations, integrating mine action response with re-greening and wider development initiatives. Next slide, please. Areas may be prioritised for clearance for reasons of socioeconomic development, which means that land release might act as an indirect driver of deforestation and land degradation by allowing access to previously inaccessible land for agricultural expansion and infrastructure construction. While the drivers of deforestation are often multiple and complex, in areas with high rates of deforestation, clearance operators should be mindful of these drivers. In Colombia, for example, the drivers include the expansion of cow pastures, extractive industries and palm oil plantations, as well as illicit industries such as illegal gold mining, logging and drug trafficking. The largest demining operator in Colombia, the National Army's Humanitarian Demining Brigade, has conducted reforestation projects in the departments with the highest rates of deforestation in which they have demining operations. Since 2016, over 290,000 trees have been planted, the vast majority of which are grown in their own nurseries. They also support regional environmental authorities with transport for seized animals and wood that have been illegally trafficked. Meaningful consultation with the local community during the land release process is important and can help reduce the risk to beneficiaries in the environment on which they depend, while improving common knowledge of environmental issues. This could also be extended to the local workforce through training on the IMAS and environmental management, climate change, and basic mitigation interventions, for example. Landmine clearance can also be used to enhance environmental protection efforts by opening up biodiverse areas to conservation and ecotourism. However, for such programs to work well, conservation strategies and environmental governance must be in place, with clear guidance on the role of demining in this process. In Angola, the Halo Trust is working to clear landmines surrounding the headwaters of the Okavango Delta and establish a series of protected areas which will allow the migration of wild animals throughout the Okavango system, including the African savanna elephant. Employment opportunities in conservation and sustainable tourism will also be made available to the local population. In Zimbabwe, Apopo is clearing mines inside the Sengwe Wildlife Corridor. This protected area is aimed at allowing the free movement of wildlife, including elephants, pangolins, lions, and endangered wild dogs, between the Kruger National Park in South Africa and Gonarezu National Park in Zimbabwe, while also increasing the potential for ecotourism in the area. Next slide. So in this section, we'll look at international law, the IMAS on environmental management and environmental impact assessments. There are limited environmental obligations in the relevant conventional arms disarmament treaties. The Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the Convention on Cluster Munitions both require that extension requests must contain information on the environmental implications of that extension. However, we found that in reality, when the environment is referenced in extension requests, it's usually very brief and tends to only refer to how contamination denies access to productive land and natural resources for local communities. The Lausanne Action Plan, adopted in September this year as part of the CCM, contains 4 actions that refer to the environment and are relevant to land release activities, which demonstrates that environmental considerations are starting to be increasingly prioritised within the sector. In addition, there are other relevant international laws and standards for states which relate to the environment, such as the objectives of the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. National mine action authorities and operators must also be guided by a country's national environmental legislation. Slide. The IMAS 713 on environmental management is the only international mine action standard dedicated to environmental management. According to the IMAS, the aim of mine action operations is to leave the environment in a state that is similar to, or where possible better than, before mine action operations commenced, and that permits the intended use of land once mine action operations have been completed. National mine action authorities should, at the very least, have a national mine action standard in place that is in line with IMAS 713. As far as we are aware, there are 9 mine or cluster munition remnant affected countries which currently have an MMAS in place. State parties should also ensure that they comply with environmental commitments within the treaties, including the guidance under the newly adopted Lausanne Action Plan. We suggest it would be helpful if the IMAS on the environment were made publicly available online so that good practice can be shared between states and lessons learned. Slide. An environmental impact assessment is an environmental management tool which aims to predict the environmental impacts at an early stage in project planning and design, find ways to reduce those negative impacts, shape projects to suit the local environment, and present the predictions and options to decision makers. An environmental impact assessment, or EIA, is a widely recognised environmental management tool for mainstreaming the environment into development projects and is often mandated by law. It's very comprehensive, and in some cases the process can take 2 years or more to complete. EIAs were used to great effect during landmine clearance of the Falkland Islands and at Skallingen in Denmark. Both were considered to be environmentally sensitive areas, with ecosystems that presented their own unique challenges to mine clearance. However, while an EIA may not always be necessary, it's good practice for organisations to incorporate at least a basic environmental assessment as part of the planning process in mine action operations. MPA has developed a simplified environmental assessment and management tool for use by its officers in mine action operations. These can be carried out by a staff member, with recommendations to complete the tool before initiating operations or opening an office, and then updating at least once a year. These tools have been made available to the mine action sector and can be found if you click on the box for the environment brief on the home page of the Mine Action Review website. Slide. So we'll now be looking at some examples of different mitigation interventions which we found during our research for the policy brief. Some organisations, such as Humanity and Inclusion, are making an organisational commitment to reduce their carbon emissions. HI plans to produce a baseline of its total greenhouse gas emissions, and then the effectiveness of mitigation measures that target emissions from, for example, travel and energy consumption, can be measured against the baseline. Replacing electricity generated by fossil fuels with renewable energy sources such as solar panels is another way of reducing an organisation's carbon footprint. The Halo Trust in Afghanistan, for example, has 180 solar panels in 7 locations across the country, reducing the energy that is drawn from fuel-powered generators. By increasing the number of solar panels, in 2020 the programme consumed 8,000 litres of fuel less every month, at a cost saving of more than $4,000. In Lao PDR, MPA has committed to improving its waste management systems by reducing the amount of rubbish it produces through minimising single-use plastics and reusing items where possible. They have also partnered with a local youth movement, Zero Waste Lao, who found large gaps in knowledge among MPA staff in response conducted trainings where staff learned how to recycle and minimise waste, including how to set up their own home composting. I won't go into detail about the role of new technologies and more environmentally friendly land release, as Martin will be talking about that during his presentation. Open burning or open detonation remains the primary disposable method for explosive ordnance disposal across the mine action sector. While new technologies are being developed, there is currently no single disposal method which can be used in place of open burning or open detonation. Examples of mine action programs using alternative disposable methods, including deflagration techniques and explosive harvesting, which can be used to recover and repurpose high explosives with appropriate environmental controls. Environmental certification schemes allow organisations to evaluate, report on, and improve their environmental performance. There are several different certification schemes available. As we can see from these examples, there are a number of different mitigation interventions already taking place within the sector, and more that are listed within the policy brief itself. But it would be helpful to document more detailed case studies of these interventions and others to provide evidence of what has and what has not worked effectively. Next slide. In the policy brief, we draw conclusions and make some recommendations for the sector based on what we've identified as the current gaps in knowledge and provision. I've talked about some of these recommendations within the presentation, such as the need for affected states to have a national mine action standard on environmental management, the integration of environmental assessment tools into programme planning activities, the importance of community engagement and of systematic data collection, and building knowledge about the environment across the sector. In addition to this, funding needs to be in place to enable national mine action authorities and operators to mainstream environmental considerations into their programme activities and to conduct more systematic follow-up after land is released to monitor environmental impacts. Next. So I want to finish by posing some questions for consideration for the sector. So does the IMAS on environmental management need to be updated? It was published in 2017 and is due for review. But does it need to be updated to take changes in the sector and more widely into account? For example, should there be a technical note on climate change adaptation within the IMAS? A working group on environmental issues and mine action has been established for a couple of years now, but what should its aims and objectives be over the coming year? Would a resource hub be useful? It could be created to share relevant information more easily and make expertise more readily available across the sector and with the wider humanitarian community. And would there be interest in an interdisciplinary seminar on the environment? There is potential to bring together speakers from both within the mine action sector and from external environmental and climate change organisations to speak about relevant topics in more depth, perhaps over an extended time period. So that's it from me for today. I'll pass you back over to Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think that was a great summary of the policy brief that, as I say, is available on our website. And just to highlight, MPA has also made available, as Alex mentioned, its environmental assessment and management tools. And if you click on the main box of the environment report on our website, there's also a link contained within it to download MPA's assessment and management tools if people want to refer to those too. So without further delay, I'm going to pass on to our next speaker, Linsey Cottrell from CEOBS. And as you can see, we'll take question and answers at the end, and the Slido barcode and number is on the screen now. Over to you, Linsey. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Just wait for my slides to come up. Okay, right. Well, they've gone again now. Just wait for the first one. Okay, right, that's fine. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you again, Lucy. And also thanks to the Mine Action Review for taking this policy paper forward, which, of course, coming from the environment sector, I think this is an excellent step. Just next slide, please. So I want to talk more about climate change, which is timely, of course, because we've just had the United Nations Climate Conference, COP26, this month in Glasgow, where governments were trying to agree action to ensure that global heating doesn't increase by more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate about the bleakness of the news, I'm afraid, I'm sure everyone is aware about the emergency, the climate emergency. In August, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued its code red warning for humanity. Before this, many governments have already declared a climate emergency. This includes the EU, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, and New Zealand. And in October this year, the UK's Environment Agency, which is the government agency responsible for environmental regulation, issued a adapt or die warning. So it's extremely rare to get such stark warnings from scientists and regulators like this. But this is because the evidence is there and it is very clear about the risks from climate change. Next slide, please. So climate change will impact us all, but many explosive ordnance affected countries are also the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change and have less resilience to dealing with the effects. So as an example, on top of the escalating humanitarian crisis, Afghanistan is bearing the combined effects of climate change and high rates of deforestation. In the east of Afghanistan, up to 80% of tree cover loss has been estimated between 1977 and 2002. And by 2019, just 1.5% of Afghanistan was estimated as woodland. That has meant that flooding in 2020 was made worse because heavy rainfall onto bare ground and sparsely vegetated slopes can cause flash flooding, since the ground has very little capacity to retain water. In Angola, although the full impact of climate change on contaminated areas is not that clear, almost all provinces have experienced severe flooding in recent years. And flooding and landslides can cause mines to move, which sometimes can result in complex transboundary issues. In 2021, floodwaters in Lebanon were reported to have caused mines along the Lebanese-Syrian border to shift. And although it's rare, munition stockpile explosions are also linked to hot weather. In Iraqi Kurdistan, an unplanned explosion took place in 2018 during scorching summer temperatures. And then we have the Sahel, south of the Sahara, where we have the problem of the advancing desert. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for mine action? So climate change can impact mine action activities, both in how tasks are prioritised and how mine clearance is conducted. But I want us to think about, also think about how mine action can help these communities adapt and cope with these extremes of climate change, like heat waves, droughts, floods, or increased soil erosion risks. And most importantly, why should it? And I'm going to try and answer the second question first. Next slide, please. So why should we make this an additional burden on the mine action community when there's even less funding available? So last month, the UK government announced the catastrophic funding cuts to mine clearance programmes from 125 down to 25 million. So there's this enormous funding gap to be filled. But there is an opportunity to bridge this funding gap and improve climate resilience for affected communities. And this means approaching donors with the opportunity to fund projects which jointly involve mine action and organisations implementing climate adaptation and environmental initiatives. And well-planned initiatives can have multiple benefits to both people and the environment. And there are strong synergies between climate and environmental initiatives. and Mine Action because both work to empower local communities and both secure sustainable livelihoods. Next slide, please. So how should this be done? It doesn't just mean planting trees. It can be looking at improving farming and grazing practices. It can be forest management, grassland protection, groundwater recharge, or catchment management schemes to reduce flooding. But it needs strategic partnerships, and there's some traction in setting these up already. For example, Halo have been doing work out in Somaliland and partnering with a local environmental charity. And when it's done well, ecosystems can be protected, restored or managed, while also providing measurable benefits for communities. And we're not talking about reinventing the wheel, we're talking about working with and supporting existing organisations. Next slide, please. And it must be the right scheme. It must be context specific. It must reflect the unique environmental setting and challenges, cultural and socioeconomic needs of local people. Is it planting or is it something like natural regeneration? So in the Sahel, some tree planting schemes under the Great Green Wall Initiative, for example, have had very high failure rates due to ineffective aftercare. And something like farmer-managed natural regeneration may work much better. And this is where farmers protect and manage the growth of trees and shrubs that regenerate naturally in their fields. And Mine Action actors can play an important role in the community engagement element. And that's because they're already doing this engagement through explosive ordnance risk education, community liaison and clearance activities. And they can help identify local priorities and communicate these to others. Mine Action organisations also typically recruit and train local staff, which can help to secure acceptance and success of such initiatives. And early community engagement is key. Sorry, can you just go back one slide, please? So, and the benefits can include reduced current deforestation rates, help to protect wildlife, support livelihoods, contribute to community cohesion, provide and build climate resilience. And we need pilot projects and the collection of project information which can be useful to others. And this must be disseminated to encourage adoption elsewhere. And it will also help to inform funders and decision makers, especially where donors have just supported traditional Mine Action programs in the past. Next slide, please. So I just want to leave us some summary points so that it's important to bring it together and clarify the implications and the joint benefits. It's important to link with partners and junior partners, the importance of supporting these existing climate and environmental work, and the importance of identifying and communicating examples of success. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to leave you also with some resources, such as a link to the Friends of Eco-Based Adaptation Network. So this is a network of around 90 organisations, and they're sharing knowledge to improve the implementation on the ground. And this also includes a working group led by Mercy Corps and the ICRC, which is specifically about using such an approach in a humanitarian context. There's also a link there to a video by Prepare, which is a climate and humanitarian crisis initiative. It only launched just a few months ago. There's a website and the resources, and that's still to be developed and built up, which will happen over time, I'm sure. Next slide, please. And that's it from me, and thank you very much for your attention. And I'd also just like to thank again Mine Action Review. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Linsey. I think sometimes it's hard for people, we're all aware that climate change is happening and we don't always think, actually how does it impact our sector? And I think that's a great reminder that it's very much relevant to Mine Action operations, and we must be thinking about adaptation measures now and the importance, as you say, of working in partnership with local organisations. So thank you for that. Now handing over to Martin from ICRC. Thanks, Martin.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Lucy. First of all, I would like to congratulate and thank the Mine Action Review for making this in-depth policy brief. I think it's a timely contribution to increase the awareness of environmental management in the mine action sector. I think we all can agree that wars threaten the environment and the lives of those who depend on it. Too often the natural environment is directly attacked or damaged during conflict, which we already heard about, and further impacted by damage and destruction to the built environment, which can further pollute the natural environment. The consequences of such environmental damage for conflict-affected populations are severe, they're complex, and they threaten their well-being and survival. When combined with climate risk, which we also just heard about, this makes the situation even worse. As we already heard, the environmental consequences are manifold, and they will have a socioeconomic impact, both on local, regional, and national scale. Though environmental management and climate change adaptation should not be viewed separately. The environmental consequences of armed conflict can also contribute to climate change. For example, the destruction of large areas of forests or damage to critical infrastructure can either increase erosion or release large volumes of greenhouse gases. The International Committee of the Red Cross and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies has already, or has recently, led the work on developing a climate and environment charter for humanitarian organizations. In this process, more than 150 organizations were consulted. The commitments in the Climate and Environment Charter offer a set of principles to guide humanitarian action in response to the climate and environmental crisis. To turn these commitments into reality, organizations should develop specific and measurable targets and design action plans that outline how they plan to meet their targets. It's basically much like what the policy brief suggests and also what the IMAS on environmental management suggests. In any case, these commitments reflect the need for a better balance between responding to rising needs and proactively reducing and adapting to the risks that the climate and environmental crisis already pose and will continue to generate in the future. Examples may be including scaling up community awareness and educational programs about risk that people face, or incorporating nature-based solutions into programming. Likewise, the ICRC guidelines on international humanitarian laws requirements for environmental protection during armed conflicts also give recommendations to mine action on how to protect the environment, especially recommendations 24 and 25. International humanitarian law does not address all the environmental consequences, but it do contain rules that provide protection to the natural environment and that seek to limit the damage caused to it by war. Mine action impacts the environment. It's an environmental work. Though appropriate assessments and management can help to incorporate environmental mitigation measures. These include sound application of land release approaches or by using innovative approaches. The Weapon Contamination Unit at the ICRC is responsible for strategies and activities to prevent and reduce the risk posed by weapon contamination. One of these activities is to use innovation to improve detection of weapon-contaminated areas using sustainable methods, which has a low environmental footprint. And one example is the project I'm running at the moment is using remote sensing and artificial intelligence to improve the probability of detection of weapon contamination. In recent years, the mine action sector has seen an increase in projects and research targeting the use of airborne remote sensing and artificial intelligence. However, the use has not become mainstreamed in the sector, even though it has a large potential to make clearance of landmines and ERWs more efficient, cost-effective, with a lower risk for clearance personnel, and especially having a low environmental footprint. These technologies have the potential to improve the capacity to assess needs and to monitor changes on the ground and can be useful in daily operations. Remote sensing is relatively inexpensive and a quick method to survey large areas of land on a variety of themes. Due to the low environmental footprint, remote sensing applications support sustainable development and are therefore in agreement with the recommendations given by the Climate Charter I mentioned before, but also the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which Alex mentioned in her presentation as well. In general, remote sensing techniques are widely used to protect and preserve the environment by providing information that may be used in decision-making to save the environment. And by saying that, it's actually widely used in the environmental sector in general and in other sectors outside of mine action. Landmines and ERWs are displayed in highly different environments. Environmental mitigation measures which protect the environment in one place might have a negative impact in another place, and some clearance techniques could actually benefit the environment. We just saw the sketch on impact craters, and one example is that detonation of impact craters in some areas can actually work as a good habitat for amphibians, but in other areas it will increase erosion. Likewise, innovative solutions will not work in all environments. Due to the diversity of environments in which mine action takes place, environmental assessment should be an important and integrated part of the work. Environmental protection is cross-sectorial, and stakeholders' coordination is crucial to address threats to the environment. Different actors can contribute with their specific expertise to find solutions that do not compromise the security of staff and cost effectiveness of operations while improving mitigation measures. Mines are cleared so that the population can get access to and use the land again by doing no harm. Not returning the land back as it was before the mines were buried will not benefit the local population who use the land, and the clearance will not lead to an improved life. Therefore, environmental considerations should be included in the mine action sector. And by that, I would like to thank you for your attention and go back to you, Lucy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. I think some really interesting points. As you mentioned, we really encourage people to check out ICRC's Climate Environmental Charter and the guide. It's really great to see how artificial intelligence and remote sensing technology is coming along. I've watched the Other Side event on that this week, and Geneva Centre and ICRC's seminar on that, and great to see how that can actually minimize the environmental footprint. And also, like you say, the importance of interventions being context specific, I think, is really important. So now I'm really happy to pass on to our final panelist, Bach from NPA Vietnam. Over to you, Bach.
Thank you, Lucy. Hi everyone, my name is Bach. I'm from NPA Vietnam. I'm very excited here to be here as a panelist and share our effort promoting environmental safeguarding and climate change as my action organization. So for my presentation, I will provide a particular view on environment and my action in Vietnam. In recent years, NPA Vietnam has been considering the environment and climate change as essential factors of our my action operation. Why and how do we do this? Next, please. Vietnam is a developing country, and it is facing many environmental issues: ecosystem degradation, insufficient waste management, and even air pollution. But here I want to focus on the issues that the whole world is concerned about: climate change. So Vietnam is identified by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change as one of the most climate change affected countries. As you can see here, the biggest consequences of climate change, the increased sea level, can put the south region of Vietnam underwater, which means 1/4 of the entire country. For now, areas where we are operating have been distressed from the impact of climate change. Beneficiaries of my action are living in climate change vulnerable areas of Vietnam will be suffering from it. These impacts, even at reduced level, will mean that land use will change. my action operation will be affected by extreme hot waves, intensive rainfalls leading to landslide and floods. Climate change also causes migration, and we will see millions of people move throughout the country, and very likely into unclear areas where they may come into contact with explosive ordnance. Next one, please. So this picture taken from central Vietnam, Quang Tri. So central Vietnam was the main battlefield during the Vietnam War, and it had been known as the magnet of storm. So every year, this area received about 6 to 7 tropical cyclones per year. However, in 2020, last year, multiple cyclones hit this region within only 1 month. Consequently, this area was isolated from other provinces. Here are, can you, next please? Here are some pictures in Hue, Quang Binh, and Quang Tri, where all of the NPA operation is located. The flood is up to 3 meters and have making this area unable to access. Next, please. Next slide, please. So our operation must stand out for 25 days. Not only that, the flood and landslide adversely affected explosive ordnance accident survivors and Agent Orange victims who already have limited access to service. Next, please. So here are still some pictures of our staff going on a survey. They cannot access, and here's a picture of one who showed the water level during the flood. Next one. Here are some picture of the EO's accident survivor, which we are able to support. Next one, please. Here's a family of a family of Agent Orange victim. Next one. So as you can see here, my action organization are not excluded from the impact of environmental degradation and climate change. So we know that if we have resources, we have the capability, there should be work to be done on this matter. Next one, please. Next one. So we start our environmental project in 2020. So the reason behind this is not only that the impact of climate change and environmental degradation, but also NPA Vietnam has been working in the country since 2007. We're working with the national government, provincial authorities, and local partners. We have acquired extensive experience in cluster munition survey, impact assessment, risk education, and capacity development. So NPA Vietnam has a unique opportunities to go home by home, to go person to person, to collect data. We have high level of expertise in information management, data analysis, and database development. So we have to admit that these are significant features that not many organizations are able to offer. When you look at the international community, the action sectors are increasingly including the environmental safeguarding and climate change in its agenda. Next one. So in order to work to have our sustainable approach to the environment, we have developed our environment and climate change strategy for 5 years. So in this, we will support our NPA global environment and climate change policy, which recognize that minimizing the climate and environmental impacts of my action activity is a vital part of achieving our mission. So our strategies take a two-tier approach. Firstly, improve our action to better protect the environment in which we conduct my action activities. This includes reducing our impact to the environment and creating an environmental monitoring system. Secondly, we will support communities where we conduct my action by giving them the resources and tools that they need to sustainably manage land and other natural resources. and also become more resilient to the impact of climate change, which also have improved the sustainability of action result. As you can see on the slide here, we set out our very clear objective in environmental activities. Next one, please. So happily, after we completed our environmental strategy, we have step on and do a lot of activities. So internally, after 2 years, with direction in the strategy, we have achieved some work. So for internal, we provide environment and climate change training for our staff. So this will have to increase their knowledge, their awareness, and on the environmental issues, environmental protection, and climate change. This creates a momentum from the core of the organization. So we have the capability from the staff to start doing the environmental works. We also developed our environmental monitoring system. This one will help us to keep track of our greenhouse gas emission from such as carbon dioxide from our vehicles, from our flights, from our use of energy, from non-renewable resources. So, and this data can help us to identify the source that we can reduce. We also keep in contact with environmental actors at the international, national, and local levels, such as UNDP, ICRC, and we exchange information. We find opportunity to combine our efforts to support communities in the environment and climate change during and after action activities. And as some of you might heard about the NPA environmental impact assessment, NPA Vietnam is also a part of the development team. We support the desktop development of the tools, and we plan to conduct a few trials of this tool in Vietnam this year. Next one, please. Next one, I would like to draw your attention to what we have done for the communities. So last year in Thừa Thiên Huế province, we support a vulnerable community. This is a historical village which receives thousands of visitors every year. This village has been overwhelmed with waste after floods that occurs more and more frequent with higher levels. We donated equipment and we provided training to increase their capability in managing solid waste and had to retain a significant historical site for Vietnam. A key point I want to mention here is that we do not invent a new approach to environment and climate change. In fact, we learn about the local needs and we learn about the problem that our experience and resources can address or be a part of the measures. Next one, please. So for this year activities, we have been doing the soil sampling in an area that we have cleared from explosive ordnance. So the existence of toxic chemical substance, such as heavy metals, in a military impacted site was found in multiple studies. IMAS is also aware of this matter. However, the lack of data have made mitigation measures extremely challenging to be identified and proper remediation to be applied. Another reason is that in concluded BAC areas, which is area contaminated with EO, local people and governmental authorities are happy to have their land back safely, but using it for sustainable development required a systematic approach, and they need support from many organizations and with a capability. So considering the context of the region, where most people rely on traditional agriculture for livelihood, stakeholders include policymakers, scientists, believe that organic agriculture and ecosystem restoration are two key approaches that can generate high-value products as well as climate change resilient measures. Then what my action organization like NPA Vietnam can do for post-clearance support? we find out that soil information is a vital part of this plan. This is why NPA Vietnam stepped in. We collaborate with a local university who have been working on ecosystem restoration, and we plan to study the long-term environmental impacts of munition by testing soil on heavy metal concentration in a concluded contaminated site. Besides, the study also provides information on soil nutrient properties for local people to make land use more sustainable based on scientific evidence. Next one, please. So here's some pictures from our operation. We train our NTS team to collect soil sample following the national standard and ISO. So this can potentially become a routine part of NTS activities. We bring in the use of a Survey 123, GIS, mapping, the reporting system that we use for my action field reports to collect data. And we also have close relation with the local and highly experienced staff to go home by home, person to person to do the survey on land use practices. All the data collected is then analyzed with advice from the local university scientists and governmental authorities for developing a sustainable development plan. Moreover, all data will be transferred to the provincial database, which NPI is now building with the provincial authorities. Next one, please. So what is the way forward? In 2022, NPA Vietnam planned to test a new method, which we named Total My Action Survey. This one combines our successful NTS with explosive ordnance risk education, victim assistance survey, environment protection identification, and action plan. So our existing NTS methodology will include collection of environment data and environment risk education alongside explosive ordnance risk education. Data on explosive ordnance accident victims will be collected, and we will do our best to link these people with service in the community that might help them. And finally, in this new method, we will develop an environment response for each village based on the needs that we'll identify during the survey. Environment actors are welcome and can easily access to environmental data obtained from this survey. So that is the way forward and what we have done in the past few years. And beyond simply meeting the IMAS 7.13 obligation, NPA Vietnam is taking a more proactive approach to the environment. This is a new but a necessary venture for us. And we always welcome thoughts and feedbacks and experience from our colleagues around the world. So I look forward to any question later in the session. Thank you for listening. That's all from me. Back to you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Bach. I think that was really useful to actually have a presentation, a kind of country-focused presentation from Vietnam's perspective, and yeah, very stark images and stats there of the impact of climate change in Vietnam, and you know, very interesting to see and to think about the impact on survivors of VO, like you say. And I also found it, very useful to actually see what an operator is doing in the field on all of these different areas and bringing the sampling into their operations and working with provincial authorities. And I think, you know, that's part of the solution as well. There's a lot that's happening from operators in the field, like NPA, from the kind of ground up. And then I know the Vietnam National Mine Action Centre is now beginning to consider whether it might have a national mine action standard on the environment, which would be great. So I think effort is actually needed at every level, from the national authorities to the provincial to the operators on the ground. So yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. So let's see how we get on with technology now for the Q&A section. First of all, maybe I can ask our kind of technical support whether anybody that's joining the system on the legislative side, so the official 19 MSP session, if anyone has any questions, they can raise their hand to ask them. And okay, I believe we have a question from the United States. So if you would like to unmute, hopefully we'll be able to hear your question. Thank you.
Hello, Lucy. Appreciate the presentations by everyone this morning. I have a question, Lucy, for you or whomever else may be able to answer it. And this is regarding the views and approach of other NGOs in the humanitarian mine action community writ large. Is the community as a whole becoming more receptive to addressing the environmental issues and challenges and revising approaches? Do we still have a long way to go with that? How is it evolving in the HMA community as a whole? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think that's an excellent question. I'll maybe throw it open to our panelists first, and then I also have a few reflections from my side, but maybe, I don't know, Alex, did you want to say a few words on that?
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, so from, during the writing of the policy brief, we reached out to operators and to national authorities because we really wanted to hear from, people's experiences on the ground at the national and local level. And I think there was definitely a strong appetite for, a strong appetite and interest in environmental issues. There's definitely work being done, and it seems like momentum is building towards, more environmental action within the mine action sector. The data and the literature, does go back about 30 years, so it's not a new topic. But obviously, in the current climate that we're in, in the situation with climate change, in the way that operators are kind of thinking about funding and how they're integrating their operations more with the local communities, I think there seemed to be an appetite for more information, more readily accessible information, and that actually there isn't a huge amount of data on what works and what doesn't work within the sector in terms of mitigation interventions. And that's something that would be useful because the mitigation interventions, there are some that are happening, but it would be good to know, I think, to make more evidence-based decision-making within the sector. But I definitely think there is an interest and an appetite for that. So it's just a question of how we build that momentum and how we kind of push the sector forward, or how we assist the sector in that endeavour.
Thanks, Alex. Did anyone else want to comment from our panelists on that question? Linsey?
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, great question. I would completely agree with everything Alex said about the fact that I feel that the momentum's there. A couple of years ago when I kind of stepped into this area, there was, yes, the literature was there, but it wasn't necessarily being talked widely within the mine action sector. And even the level of knowledge within donors, I think, was fairly limited as to what their expectations would be of the mine action community. And Alex's point about the sharing of what works well, And what doesn't work, I think, is really, really important as part of that sharing knowledge and building expertise across the sector. And also, you know, the really difficult ones. There's still a lot to do, and there's some very, very difficult challenges. You know, the one that Alex mentioned about open burning and open detonation. It's been, you know, it's a long-term practice, and the solution is very difficult because it's going to cost money. And you know, I think that's one of the many challenges ahead for the mine action sector.
Thanks very much for that, Linsey. I mean, yeah, I fully agree with what Alex and Linsey have said. I think we're definitely seeing more engagement with the topic. You know, we were seeing international clearance operators are now employing dedicated people, environmental experts within their organisations to help formulate policies. I think there's actually quite a lot of examples of good practice, like we've heard from Vietnam, MPA in Vietnam. It's just kind of, we need to find a forum of actually sharing some of that so that we can learn from what's happening in different programs. Yeah, Martin, did you want to say a few
just
words?
very briefly for the question from the USA, that's definitely when we wrote the IMAS 713 back in 2017, there was not very much evidence to find anywhere. So we had to look very much into mitigation measures from other sectors. So I can only agree that it would be appropriate to have a place where we could share the knowledge on what is working and what is not working. So just a brief comment from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I believe we also have a question from Norway, from inside the system we're working on. If you'd like to unmute and ask the question.
Yes, hi Lucy. Thank you, and thank you to the Mine Action Review for excellent presentation again, and to all the panelists for really informative and good presentations. I just wanted to jump in, as I'm the new environment person in Norwegian People's Aid. And just wanted to say that we are very eager to work together on this important issue moving forward, and also together with the Mine Action Review. And just a small note, since it has been mentioned already, that this environmental impact assessment tool, that is something that we have been working on in MPA over more than a year. And we are currently piloting it in a few of our programs. But of course, it's now the big work is actually starting, is having this implemented, and then in the extension of that, finding ways to actually mitigate our environmental and climate carbon footprint. That's the big work. So I look forward to join forces and work on it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilda. And sorry, that was Norwegian People's Aid, not the Norwegian government. We also have a question. I'll take one question maybe from Slido first. And we also have a question that was given in advance from Geneva Centre. So I have a question here from Eric Pettersson from Sweden, CEDA. He says, thank you for highlighting the environmental climate change. Feedback from operators indicate that environmental impact assessments are seldom done. Why do we think that that's the case, that environmental impact assessments aren't standard practice at the moment? So I don't know who would like to address that point from the panel. Linsey?
Thank you. I don't mind having a go first. I think there's probably three core reasons. It's not being, if the national standard isn't there, it's not necessarily being asked of by authorities. It's not being necessarily required by donors. And when, you know, some of the reporting I've seen with respect to donors is very simple. about whether there is or isn't environmental impacts. It's not kind of supported by necessary assessments, and also the term EIA and the kind of whole process, I think, is seen as very cumbersome and quite a burden. So that's hopefully with the step like the MPA tool, trying to simplify that process, introducing a checklist mechanism will hopefully encourage more of that kind of more simplified approach to assessments, so that the key issues and the mitigation steps can be more clearly tracked and acted upon.
Thanks, Linsey. Alex and Martin, did you want to come in? Alex first, maybe?
Yeah, I guess just to add to Linsey's excellent points, that I think maybe there's still a kind of attitude that environmental impact assessments or environmental assessments only need to happen when you're dealing with an area that's environmentally sensitive or has been identified as environmentally sensitive, in a pre-existing way. So, for example, environmental impact assessments were used, really comprehensive impact assessments were used in the Falkland Islands and Sculling, and Martin worked in that project. And they had a huge amount of pre-identified environmental sensitivities in those areas. And I guess the point that we wanted to try and push across, and that hopefully the MPA tool is a step in that direction, is that environmental impact assessments, a more basic environmental assessment, should be used as just part of the planning process, because actually there isn't any way of really knowing what the environmental impacts will be until an assessment is done, because an area could have potentially great environmental importance, but it doesn't necessarily look like an area of particularly kind of, it's not a national park, it's not an area that's been designated as such. Yeah, that was just my addition.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I think that's an important point to know. Martin?
Yeah, I would just agree with what Linsey said about the assumption on what an environmental impact assessment is. That it sounds like a huge work, which it is in some cases, of course. And that was also why it's not mentioned as a need to do thing in the IMS 713, but it's a more general talking about doing some environmental assessment together with other assessments. That said, we came across different papers when we made the IMS, one of which showed that most countries in the world actually have a legislation on environmental impact assessment when you do construction work in the environment. They're just not very well used and probably not very well known. So I also think it's a awareness question here, that we need to build some kind of knowledge and awareness about this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and Bach, would you like to come in on that too?
I just agree with Martin that EIA is sometimes referred to a legal process. So there might be some understanding that doing EIA means that you have to do a very huge work. But if we can simplify this tool, so even people with no environmental background can also do this, it might be more applicable to the My Action organization.
Thanks, Bach. I think that's a really important point to note. And what we're really aiming for, I think, is for true mainstreaming of environmental considerations. So just thinking about these things at the pre-planning stages, like the implementation stage of survey and clearance operations, and then post-clearance as well. And doesn't necessarily have to be a huge undertaking, but it needs to be part of the standard consideration, a bit like how we're mainstreaming gender and diversity through all actions of mine action. We need to kind of be treating the environment in the same way. There was also one other comment from a question from Eric from Swedish government, SIDA. Are there examples where released land have been transformed to nature reserves? And are any national mine action strategies, are there any national mine action strategies that include goals on this? So kind of converting land to conservation. I don't know if anybody wanted to come in on this from the panel. It's a great question. Alex.
So the examples that we looked at in the policy brief in terms of conservation are the Halo project in Angola and also a clearance project in Zimbabwe being done by Apopo. And those were looking at conservation of land that had already been designated a national park. But there is obviously, I mean, it's quite I think quite an important issue within mine action is that, you know, landmines can have a protective effect on the environment and, you know, the DMZ, and, you know, there's also areas in Iraq which, or in Iran where landmines have allowed for like a certain species of wildcat to thrive. And so it's actually really important to think about, you know, when clearance takes place in those areas, how the land is going to be used afterwards. And yeah, that I don't think that's something that's really thought about enough at the moment in a kind of systematic way. And I think that's a really good question, a really important point, and one that I don't have the answer to exactly. But yeah, I'm not currently aware of any mine clearance that's directly led to creation of a national park, but potentially in the future.
Yeah, it would be great to see. And yeah, I don't know if anyone else has any direct experience of that or anything to add on that. Linsey?
Yeah, not only to say that, yes, I'm not aware of any either. So it is definitely a step which needs addressing for the future. And if anyone does know of any, please do let us know.
Yeah, I mean, we would like to come up with more detailed case studies potentially next year of things such as this. So it'd be great to find out if that is happening. Bach. I think you're muted, sorry.
Sorry, I think there is a reason why we don't have an exact example on that, because most of the other mine action operation, demining work, is focused on releasing land that serve the economic development purpose. So what I would like to point out is that when we do, after releasing the land, we can provide post-clearance support to the land users. Some of them may not know how to use the land because the land is under the property of the government or the public. So it might be can be turned into ecosystem restoration project or something like that, if we can have the right linkage with the environmental actors who can have the resource and capability to support them. Yeah. So that is also what we are also trying to aim to do in Vietnam, linking different actors.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a very good point, I think. Martin, did you want to add something, or is that old?
No, that was just a comment, because going back to the Scaling project, so it was, of course, protected by, I don't know how many European and Danish national legislations on environmental protection. But during the clearance, it was also turned into a national Watton Sea Park. So the areas we cleared, of course, would not be used for any how would you say, construction, or it would be returned to the environment itself without any further damage or impact from people, other than it's a recreational area for Danes to go into the nature. Yeah, so I don't know if that would qualify as a case, but it's at least it was turned into a Danish national park during clearance.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's similar for the Falklands as well. You know, it's going to stay the same land use and, you know, diverse with the penguin colonies and like the protected sand dune areas. But I don't know the official status of that. Maybe we can just take a question that has been submitted from Geneva Centre, and it's regarding our kind of comment that it could be good to review and revise the IMAS 713. And the question is, could the panel describe some of the potential changes that could be made to IMAS on the environment? I don't know who wants to go first on that. Alex?
So as I kind of briefly mentioned during the presentation, you know, I mean, the IMAS is a brilliant resource, and it's really important that there is an environmental management standard within mine action. And, you know, it's just that it was published in 2017, it's due for a review, and so as part of the review process, are there elements that need to be updated, kind of taking into account changes within the sector and kind of changes more widely within the humanitarian community? So an area that I touched upon was climate change. You know, for example, should there be a technical note on climate change included within the IMAS? At the moment, you know, climate change isn't mentioned and wasn't part of the original remit of the IMAS, but, you know, as it's now kind of the centre stage that it's taking, and also, you know, the impact that we know that it's going to have on land release operations, is it something that needs to be considered? And then I guess also an area that could potentially be looked at is something we've talked about today, is the environmental assessments aspect of it. Environmental impact assessments are talked about within the IMAS, but, you know, do we as a sector need to kind of, obviously we're talking a lot about the MPA's kind of simplified tool, but do we as a sector need to come up with kind of some more streamlined guidance around environmental assessments, and should that be, you know, included within the IMAS or updated within the IMAS?
Thanks, Alex. I think, yeah, all important considerations. And like we say, it's kind of posing the question. We feel like it's definitely worth the community, you know, scheduling to actually look at this IMAS again and then collectively discussing it as a community. Martin, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, so basically, which is also stated in the IMAS, is that it builds on the ISO 14001, and therefore also the plan, do, check, act principles, which basically state that when you have documents or you have planning, then you need to take these plans out once in a while and update them. So and that's mentioned specifically in this IMAS. So just for that reason, I think it would be interesting to take it out and have a look at it and see, okay, what do we actually need to improve in this? And I very much agree on the assessment part. Maybe be more specific on which types of assessment could be done in different environments. And also, I think it was, when we made it, was quite ambitious probably for the sector, and it would be interesting to get some feedback from what's been done and how we can adapt it so that it fits better to what is actually being done in the clearance operations. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And yeah, congratulations for drafting a good IMAS back in 2017, where there really wasn't much to kind of draw from the community. Linsey.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, solid guidance, but yeah, it will benefit from a review and see where elements can be strengthened. As Alex mentioned, yeah, there is some mention of climate change with respect to, I think, some planting of crops which will be resilient to climate change. But yes, it definitely needs that to be looked at with respect to how mine action can adapt to climate change. And then I think there's something that could be strengthened on the responsibilities, on coordinating with other stakeholders and with respect to environmental regulators, and the elements I talked about in my presentation about other environmental organisations that may be able to support mine action work. I think there is talk in the IMAS about soil management as well, and I think that could be strengthened a bit. I think soil is one of the really, really, really undervalued resources, and people generally don't think about it as a resource, but how critical and important it is. And also from a climate point of view, it's a really, really important carbon sink as well. So, where that could maybe strengthened about how you undertake soil stripping, stockpile management, that kind of stuff. Things like burning vegetation, I think that could probably be strengthened about, the negative impacts on climate change with respect to that, and air quality impacts from burning vegetation. And yeah, a bit of an overview on, there's some issues with respect to how some activities may be impacted by climate change. For example, obviously there's incidences where solid waste disposal has to take place, but how that might be affected by changing environment, if you're talking about higher groundwater levels or potential for flooding in some areas as well. So that needs to be thought about. But yeah, everything.
Yeah, sounds like this. Yeah, lots of
yeah,
food.
But everything can benefit from a review, and this is no exception.
Yeah, absolutely agree. We have. I'm just looking at. Maybe I can just actually ask: was there any other hands raised from our delegates from 19 MSP? I don't know if technical support can confirm if there is. Okay. I'll take, maybe there's I realise we're kind of getting towards an hour and a half now, so maybe just a few final questions so that people can also have a bit of a break from screen time before rejoining plenary in half an hour's time for those that are. But there's a question here. It doesn't say who it's been posted by, but are there any plans to reinvigorate the environment working group? And could we share some more information on this, please? So I don't know if maybe someone could actually say a few words about what the environment working group is at the moment. I don't know if you wanted to, Linsey, maybe, and then we can talk about, the work it has done.
I'm happy to say, it has stalled and it needs to be reinvigorated, and this is the perfect time to do it. So it's just an informal working group with the idea of sharing the chair of the group and bring together exactly those points about sharing what's been working well and what's not necessarily been working well. And we kind of knew that this was coming, so it was we'll postpone the relaunch. We talked about new recruits as well, and we know that Halo Trust are getting a dedicated post for the environment as well. In the new year, I think they're joining, and not that we're holding off for that, but a great time to reinvigorate this group as well. So if anyone wants to get in touch with me directly, but we do hope to see how we can kickstart that again.
Did anyone else want to comment on that? I guess from Mine Action Review side as well, we've now joined or attending the working group. I guess we can join it officially, and we're very keen to work with the working group and to actually look at what the next steps are, and maybe we can use that to also kind of help feed into the whether IMAS needs reviewing. Maybe there's and looking at ways that we can actually create a kind of a repository for resources on the environment. I think that would be really useful to have somewhere where resources are placed that people can draw from. So I think there's definitely the potential, and I know NPA's also got, we met Hilda who made that intervention earlier on the environment. So I think there's a lot of good expertise, and I guess also ultimately we'd like to expand that working group to include affected countries as well, and national NGOs on the ground, and really draw on all aspects of expertise to have it as a inclusive working group and working out how we really take this forward as a sector. And there was one, maybe we can have this as the final question, and it's kind of linked to what was discussed earlier on environmental impact assessments. Is there is there donor willingness to fund environmental impact assessments in the context of mine action activities? I don't know if anyone wanted to comment on that. Martin.
Yeah, that's a pretty crucial question, isn't it? So it's what I found out again when working on these matters was that there was quite some interest from international environmental organizations like the Ramsar Convention, which is protecting wetlands. And they showed some interest in actually in advising on how you could protect areas that were mined in wetlands. So I'm not quite sure whether or not they will bring funding, but at least they showed interest in how to collaborate. And that was one of my points in my presentation, I think, as well, is that we need to find the people who have the expertise in different areas and then sit down and work together, and doesn't necessarily have to be very costful. It's just spending a bit of time finding those people who have an interest in it, and it could easily be a local NGO as well, for that matter. But that's definitely something worth looking into. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I think, like you say, it doesn't have to be a really cost intensive, you know, often it's not at all. But I do think that cost question does come up. Is this an extra burden for mine action programs? And we just need to have an honest conversation about that. But if we're not taking in the cost on the environment into consideration, you know, when we're doing operations, then we're not having a meaningful cost-benefit analysis anyway, because we're missing this key aspect of potential environmental harm that can then have its own costs associated with it for the affected communities. So I think it's a really important discussion that needs to be had, and to kind of debunk some of these feelings that it does have to come at a cost. I don't know if anyone had any final comments, and I'm also a bit mindful of time. Did the panelists, yeah, Alex?
Yeah, I guess just to say that it kind of links with a question that Camille from Halo Trust sent in, which is, what are your views on how mine action organisations can fund the additional resources and activities that we aspire to deliver? Do you think there are opportunities for us to align with climate and conservation funding and the carbon markets? And, you know, I think that's something that Linsey touched upon during her presentation, was the fact that actually by taking environmental considerations into account as part of planning and programme activities, that potentially opens up new funding streams for the mine action sector. And, you know, as the environment becomes, or, you know, is it a priority for donors and will become an increasing priority, or it's very likely to become an increasing priority, it's something that, you know, organisations will need to be more mindful of in terms of funding streams. I don't know if Linsey also wanted to say something about.
Yeah, I think sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, I agree with what Alex just said, and also that it might not be asked of now by donors, but I would be very surprised if it's not asked more of in the future. So it's getting ready to be able to demonstrate as an operator as that you have the tools in place to be able to do that, and, you know, whether it is that simplified approach which can still address the issues and it's not a full-blown EIA, that's a way that you can be able to demonstrate that to the donors that you're undertaking the provisions that are required. But as you say, if it's not done, the long-term impacts could be much more costly and long-term if they're not addressed as part of the actual mine action process.
Yeah, thanks, Linsey. And thank you, Camille from Halo, for that question and comments, yeah, in support of the panelists and the presentations. And maybe I can just kind of flag on the side note, I know that Halo has just launched a policy paper on conflict, climate and conservation, which is on social media and their website. So encourage people to also take a look at that. And great to see the operators really kind of taking up these key topics for the sector. And maybe that's a good point to end on, that this is an ongoing conversation, and we hope next year to maybe be able to even do a seminar or something to actually give each of these aspects a bit of a more detailed discussion and consideration, and really help take the sector forward in this regard. But I'd really like to thank all of the panelists. Thanks to my colleague Alex for her work on the paper, which I know has been a lot of hard work pooling all of this information together, and also to the excellent presentations, and to everyone that's joined us today online, and also online within the meeting of state parties. So thank you very much, everyone, and wishing you all a good rest of the day and weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.